Chapter 5, Video 2. Okay, today we're going to talk about the oral glucose tolerance test, the OGTT. If you look in your book on page 105, there is a table in here, the GTT procedure. This goes through step by step what you're doing when you perform an oral glucose tolerance test. One big thing to remember, with an oral glucose tolerance test, this test is recommended. It's often done with people who are pregnant, and with people who are pregnant and that are at high risk of gestational diabetes, but they check everyone who is pregnant with this. So OGTT stands for the oral glucose tolerance test. The glucose tolerance test is done to diagnose hypoglycemia and diabetes mellitus. Listen, hypoglycemia is a low blood sugar, okay? Hyperglycemia is a blood sugar that is elevated. So hypo is low, hyper is high. But this oral glucose tolerance test is done to detect hypoglycemia and diabetes mellitus. Please do not confuse diabetes mellitus with diabetes insipidus. Diabetes insipidus is something completely different. So if you see diabetes insipidus, INSIPIDUS, please know that that is something completely different than diabetes mellitus, and we will get into that later. So one thing that, guys, that you're going to need to really hone in on and pay attention to moving through this chapter, talking about the oral glucose tolerance test, is the timing. I need you guys to really understand the timing of the oral glucose tolerance test. So, again, we're going to have a requisition form with our lab order. You're going to need the flavored glucose solution. You're going to need your gloves, tourniquets, alcohol pads, evacuated tube holders, needles, evacuated tubes, sharp container, 2x2 gauze, bandage, biohazard bag. So there's a list of things that you're going to need when you're performing that oral glucose tolerance test, but timing is huge. Again, we're going to introduce the patient. We're going to identify the patient, and we're going to explain what we're doing to the patient. But the first thing that we need to do with an oral glucose tolerance test is confirm that this patient has been fasting, okay? You do not want to continue with this procedure if the patient has not fasted like they should. So, knowing the timing, what is very important is from the time that you start the test, from the time that you start this oral glucose tolerance test, you're going to give the patient a solution to drink. They have 5 minutes to drink this solution. Not longer than 5 minutes. From the time they start that solution, they have 5 minutes to get that solution down. After that 5 minutes is up, they have 5 minutes to drink it, but just say, for instance, they only take 3 minutes to drink the solution. Your timing begins when they finish drinking that solution. So they have a 5-minute window to get that solution down, but you may have a patient who turns it up, chugs it, and they're done with it in 30 seconds. You may have another patient who takes the entire 5 minutes. But the timing starts from the second that they take the last swallow of that solution, okay? So then here is your orders after that. And this is just an example. If this fasting blood sugar was collected at 7:10, and then the patient finished drinking their solution at 7:13, then 7:13 would be your start time, and then your 7:13 would be your start time, and then your samples would start rolling in after that, okay? So if you're on a 1 hour, if you're going to collect 3 samples, then every 3 hours, so your timing would start at like 7:13. At 8:13, you would take sample 1, 9:13, 2, 10:13, 3. So with a 3-hour test, we have 3 samples. Samples collected with the 2-hour test equals 2 samples. So if they're doing a 2-hour test, then there's going to be 2 samples. If they're doing a 3-hour test, then there's going to be 3 samples. But the timing starts at the time that they finish drinking that solution. The gray stopper tube for samples collected. The gray stopper tube is for samples collected with an oral glucose tolerance test. So we will use the gray stopper tube. Again, know these orders, know the times, and understand that. So if a patient finishes drinking a solution at 8:45, think about when you're going to collect their first sample. They finish drinking that solution at 8:45. That first sample is going to be collected at 9:45, 1 hour later. And then that second sample at 10:45. And that third sample at 11:45, just depending on how many that you have to have. But again, please take the time to understand and know all of the information about the oral glucose tolerance test, because it's very important. Know the steps, know the purpose. When we're talking about diabetes mellitus, there's different things that they can do to diagnose the person with diabetes mellitus. One is the hemoglobin A1C, and y'all need to know these tests and understand what you're looking for. A hemoglobin A1C equal to or greater than 6.5 is diagnostic of diabetes mellitus. If they have a fasting plasma glucose greater than 126, that is indicative of diabetes mellitus. And if they have a 2-hour oral glucose tolerance test that's equal to or greater than 200, that is indicative of diabetes mellitus. Guys, I want you to understand diurnal variation. Diurnal variation is changes in levels that occur throughout the day. Diurnal variation is linked to time collections. Again, they must be collected at a specific time. The doctor himself usually orders a specific time for these tests. And if you're attempting a collection linked to diurnal variation and you cannot find that patient, then you're going to need to talk to the doctor and you're going to need to reschedule. So just say that you have a time test and it's based on diurnal variation. You go to the patient's room and the patient went down for a procedure and is not going to be back for 2 hours. You need to let that doctor know, okay, look, Mr. Jones was not in his room. He was downstairs, so what do you want me to do? Do you want me to wait and take this tomorrow or at this point in time? So again, just remember when we're thinking about diurnal variation, we're thinking about the time test and how they're collected at certain times. Diurnal variations, there are substances that exhibit diurnal variation. These are affected by diurnal variation, okay? So when we're talking diurnal variation, the cortisol, testosterone, estriadiol, progestin, renin, thyroid stimulating hormone, serum iron, your white blood cells, these are all affected by that diurnal variation. So know diurnal variation and understand the time with that. Understand the definition and understand what's affected by the diurnal variation. Now we're going to talk about therapeutic drug monitoring. We talked about the peak and the trough. You heard me mention peak and trough. The peak and trough levels, they monitor therapeutic drug levels, okay? The trough level is drawn prior to administering the medication. So think about trough being at the lowest point. So that trough level is drawn right before you give the medication. And that peak level, you're going to check that peak level at a certain time, whatever time the doctor tells you. That peak level is going to be checked because that is the time that the doctor thinks that the medication is going to be in their system at the strongest level. Okay, so peak is, think about, that's when they're going to have the most drug in their body. The trough is going to be when they have the least amount of drug in their body. And that trough level is drawn right prior to administering the medication. The peak and trough information includes, you must include on the requisition, the time the medication was given, the method of medication administration, and the time that the sample was collected. So all of this information is very important to put on the requisition form and to make note of when we are collecting a peak and trough or collecting a lab that's monitoring a therapeutic drug. Here are the different drugs that are monitored by different labs. We have digoxin, phenobarbital, lithium, gentamicin, topramycin, vancomycin, dilantin, amikacin, valproic acid, theophylline, methotrexate, and various antibiotics. So again, please be familiar with these different drugs. Documentation, how we document, again, sample handling, time, method of administration, the time of collection. All of this information is very important that you document this information. The half-life of the medication, it affects the timing of the peak. Okay, so knowing the half-life, and please look up half-life and understand what half-life means. Half-life is the time that it takes for the medication to get out of your system, okay? So understanding that half-life affects therapeutic drug monitoring. So different drugs may take longer to filter out of the body. So that peak and trough level may be drawn at different times. That is it for this video. We will continue with another video and go over blood culture soon.